And good afternoon, good morning, good evening, whenever you happenstance into this Truth Bomb riff. My name is Patrick Lovell, and I'm coming to you on Tuesday, May 21st, 2024, at approximately 3 p.m. my time. And it's my great pleasure to reconnect with Mr. William K. Black, a gentleman that has graced me through the years with some incredible insight and understanding of how things work. I guess just at the top, couple of corollaries. He's a professor of, you know what? I didn't bring up your.
It's all right. I'm retired from University of Missouri, Kansas City at this juncture anyway. So you can say
Congratulations.
I was a professor, of economics and law at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and teaches now at the University of Minnesota Law School.
And many, many, many more things. So we'll continue forward. And I apologize for that, but it's just I'm very eager to get this conversation, Bill. And by the way, congratulations. I understand that your wife June Carbone has got her hardbook copy of her book, and I believe you guys are about to go on tour with the book.
Yeah, she is. Fair shake. And so it is in publication now, and she is doing the book tour. And she'll probably get a chance to talk to you in more detail about it at some point.
Fantastic. Well, the reason we're going to kick this conversation off, which is slightly different than the last couple that we've had, and there's a lot going on, obviously, with the last remaining days, I guess, of the only criminal trial we'll see of former President Donald Trump, and maybe we'll get a couple of minutes to talk about that towards the end. But more prescient to this dialogue is an article that somebody that I have followed for years and years and years and have been in contact with and befuddled by on many levels, because as we basically went down the path to create our work, The Con, based on the information that we were able to learn from you and that you were able to guide us through, which was monumental to the work that Matt Taibbi started off with. Matt Taibbi seemingly disappeared from view on this front, and was during our process really difficult to connect with in a way that was antithetical given some of his work at the time. And to give you an example, I had become very close with his former editor and one of his best friends, a guy at Rolling Stone magazine by the name of Will Dana, and I had actually gotten on the phone with Matt Taibbi right after he had actually been on the Joe Rogan podcast right about the 10th anniversary of the great financial crisis. And interestingly enough, the focus of his discussion with Rogan at the time, which I think was probably seen by tens of millions of people, or at least views, don't know what that actually approximates in, the actual data, but slightly different than everything that he'd always been talking about before, was he chose to talk about the African-American community, particularly females that were been predated upon, that were sort of analogous to his book, The Great Derangement, and also some of other fantastic work at that time that dealt with the GFC. But it was interesting because he had really started to emphasize the predation, but he never closed the loop to elite predation in a manner that we came close to based on the work that you've been doing really since the 80s and the SNL crisis and everything else. And so Matt Taibbi writes this Substack article being very critical of MMT, otherwise known as modern monetary theory. And I think it took us both by surprise and was revealing, to say the least. Bill, when we think about what Matt addressed in his sort of, not just his critique, but it was almost an attack, if you will, on MMT, it seemed to be slightly antithetical to where Matt might have been when he kind of made his chops pursuing the truth of what was happening during the GFC. Can you kind of give us your reaction?
Yeah, I think you're understating it considerably. He's had a reverse road to Damascus conversion, and he is now full in favor of the modern plutocrats. And he is all out to prevent them from being taxed at higher rates, and he doesn't want them, prosecuted and such. And he sure doesn't want full employment because that would be bad, for the incredibly wealthy people because they'd have to pay more for their workers and such, and they hate those things. So yes, the guy that once had the colorful phrase about Goldman Sachs, that right, there was like the vampire squid shoving its feeding tube into every possible opening, even once you become a cadaver, type of thing, and getting the last bit of value out and stealing it for itself. That guy has reinvented himself as the great defender of the predators. And not just their ability to predate, but to make sure that once they predate successfully, they get to keep their money and not have it taken away by prosecutions or higher taxes and such.
Well, I mean, as shocking as that opening statement is, I find it completely accurate and also parallel to the trajectory that many of us who've been critical of Matt Taibbi for the course of the last several years, particularly as it related to his work with Elon Musk and supposedly, the sort of deep dive into all things censorship by way of the previous ownership of Twitter. And it was called remarkably the Twitter Files. And it seemed to be, in retrospect, and I've seen several interviews, and Matt has revealed himself on a couple of occasions to discuss that, yeah, there was some strangeness that he was trying to get to some revelations, but yet he was kind of following the lead of Elon Musk, and Elon Musk turned on him. And it was just a kind of a.
Yeah, again, it's worse. It's worse than that. He agreed to something that no real journalist would agree to, which is, I'll give you some documents that I think make the point I want to make, and I'm not going to give you access to other documents that prove the opposite. And then you write a hit piece, and many of us have seen Mehdi Hasan's epic takedown, in which it's sad, type of thing. So yes, this column, first, it brings together many of the topics we've talked about, and secondly, it's unintentionally revealing about how the sycophants of that are trying to give aid and comfort to the most elite predators are trying to frame their argument about how it's the other folks. It's the folks coming against the elite predators that are the problem, not the elite predators. They're the good guys.
But see, again, so antithetical to what, the bones that made Taibbi what he is, and to some of us, one of the greatest journalists of all time, particularly of that era. But what a complete pivot. But in regards to MMT and this Substack article criticism that you're going to go into detail about, I want to set this up for the viewer first to understand a little bit. So when I went through the 2008 great financial crisis, like millions of other people, one of the only people I could depend on for information that made sense to me at the time was Matt Taibbi as a journalist at Rolling Stone magazine. And he would write 10,000 word essays on some of the most beguiling revelations of multi-dimensional fraud involving the likes of Goldman Sachs, as Bill pointed out, which he referred to as the great vampire squid, but also AIG and also Chase. In fact, he had a whistleblower, Bill, as you may recall, Elaine Flashman, who was revealing a lot of the predation that we would ultimately come to learn about. I was actually in Will Dana's office the day that the cover of Rolling Stone magazine went to print, and they brought it to Will Dana, who was the editor, for review. And I'll never forget, after talking to you initially before we started to get into the con and everything that would ultimately lead to, I was there when they rolled out the cover saying it was a $9 billion witness, which Elaine Flashman, this attorney who worked for Chase, who was from Whistler or Vancouver, BC, was saying a lot of the same things that I was learning from you at the time about the predation as it related to the elite management, particularly Jamie Dimon, CEO of Chase. So these are the types of things that I would refer to for people like me who love music. I mean, I thought of Matt Taibbi in this time period as like literally Led Zeppelin 4. It was just so poetic and so majestic because it was plain speak for people like me that could go, oh, this whole thing is a con, which inspired me to reach out to Bill to learn the intricacies of how this whole thing worked. And interestingly enough, from the very beginning, I reached out to Matt Taibbi for years and years and years to come in and understand what it was that I was learning from Bill to kind of join forces and collaborate and move forward, which never happened. Now, interestingly enough, as we get into this now more detailed dialogue that I'll leave it to Bill, and I'm going to follow your lead, Bill, but MMT is a description of how our financial fiscal system operates. I mean, in plain speak, and there's going to be a lot more that Bill will fill in the blanks on details, but Matt Taibbi, alongside, and I've noticed this, Bill, a comedian who's a joke of all jokes, a guy by the name of Jimmy Dore, and others, suddenly all at the same time had created this echo chamber attack because there's this film that just got released, directed by Marin Poitras of MMT, called Finding the Money, which was built on Stephanie Kelton's seminal book that happened a number of years ago called The Deficit Myth. And in this particular takedown, as it were, it is intriguing to understand that a guy who understood the epic level of fraud that was taking place in our financial markets, and ultimately getting inside the machine and understanding how things were working, and what he would question, like financial products and derivatives and innovations and all those things, to just try to unpack that they were all fraud, but not really fully understanding the causation of what it led to. And ultimately what it leads to this is that suddenly the system that had to clean up the madness post 2008 through a lot of emergency maneuverings and bailouts that we'll get into more detail as we go, suddenly is the boogeyman now that is creating all of the problems that he refers to as magic money. Can you pick up on some of those thoughts and try to make sense why Taibbi is saying?
Yes, so he has gone back, as I said, to the subject of the great financial crisis, but now what he's revealing, or purports to be revealing, it does, again, with this reverse road to Damascus transformation, it's a bit hard to know what is real out of all this. He's demonstrating, or purporting to demonstrate, that his analytics were horrific, not superb, in the great financial crisis. That's before he gets to MMT, where his analytics are non-existent and it's all just, nasty word type stuff. So that, again, is the unintentionally revealing stuff. Let me give you specific examples of this. First, I'm not even sure that the word fraud appears in his write-up about the great financial crisis. He uses the word predator at one point to emphasize that not all these people were predators. And
you're talking about the Substack article specifically,
right? And who is rehabilitated? Well, that would be the folks at JP Morgan. So the Jamie Dimons that he used to criticize, these are the folks that were honest folks that just didn't see every possible ramification in an unpredictable financial world. And so they pushed these credit default swaps, and who knew it would produce a problem, but it was supposed to produce. And then he goes on this unbelievable string of things that credit default swaps were supposedly going to transform our entire economy and world. And they were going to make all of us, vastly wealthier all over the world. You're like, what? There's no conceivable way they could do that. That's insane, type of thing. And he, as I say, wants to emphasize that those the bankers, the elite, as he calls them, financial engineers. In fact, he says the best and brightest of the financial engineers in the world just couldn't understand these terrible things. But what he doesn't understand actually is credit default swaps.
Right.
And what he doesn't understand is what they were supposedly insuring, where that word is misleading, which was collateralized debt obligations. Now, these are two of the three big things with liar's loans that you would absolutely have to know cold to understand the great financial crisis, or to understand what the whistleblower, as you say, what she was trying to tell him, which, never came out about, well, yes, this is a classic looting fraud scheme of the kind, that I write about, but also Nobel laureates, George Akerlof and Paul Romer wrote about looting, the economic underworld of bankruptcy for profit. All that stuff disappears. And so you get this weird, what he leaves in and what he leaves out, and it isn't random. It's all designed to stack a story that is false and make it look like it's strong. So that's, really pretty awful. So here's what he says about, for example, about credit default swaps. He says that when he heard the pitch, and the pitch from the investment bankers, the financial engineers, was, this is just like insurance. And that his reaction upon hearing it was, hey, this is just like insurance, but it's not insurance. And what is it going to do? Well, it's going to much, much, much more cheaply insure you against you, the holder of a credit default obligation, a CDO, against loss. Well, wait a minute. The insurance doesn't reduce the likelihood of the loss unless there's some weird stuff about what we call adverse selection that he's not talking about at all. In fact, adverse selection goes way up under the CDS model. And so if you're using that, he should have reached the opposite result. But the story goes on. And remember, his big critique in this whole article about MMT is supposedly it's magic MMT. Right? And because what I'm about to describe is pure magic, it's just that he believed it. So here's the magic. For some reason, we, even though the losses will be the same, if we use credit default swaps, can protect you against those losses, which remember are unchanged, at a fraction of the price of insurance companies. Well, why? The losses are the losses. You're going to have to pay, in the case of AIG, somewhere potentially in the order of, absent a bailout, $20 to $80 billion. That's not going to change. But he goes on. And that was because we could do it so much more cheaply, we will shed, and this is an odd word for finance, right? Mountains of bank capital. Well, wait a minute. Bank capital is what's supposed to keep the bank safe so that we don't have to bail the damn thing out because it doesn't fail. So why would we, having not changed whatever the loss is on credit default swaps, 20 to 80 billion, it's still going to be 20 to 80 billion. But now we're going to allow banks, in fact, encourage them to get rid of mountains of capital. Well, if you get rid of mountains of capital and you have these massive losses, what happens to your bank? It fails. But also, who else fails? The insurer. In this case, AIG, that's issuing the credit default swaps. They ain't going to be able to pay the money. So those are going to fail. But he's not done explaining this enormous thing. And because we have supposedly bought insurance on the ultra cheap at a tiny fraction of what it will actually cost, right, in losses, because we bought it on the ultra cheap, we were able to get rid of mountains of capital And that lets us grow much faster. In other words, we're supercharging the Ponzi scheme. Is that good? No, that's horrible. And Taibbi used to write about that being terrible. And what's the fourth part of all of this? That the investment banker told him the story, and he believed it, and he believes it today, right? 16 years later, then wealth will blossom all over the world in all kinds of places, as he says. We'll all get rich. Now, this is definitionally the magic bean story of all time. But his metaphor for his criticism of MMT is magic beans. And he says, once he heard this insane pitch by an investment banker who is, as we say, talking his book. In other words, he says things that makes his asset more valuable. So he's not exactly someone you should trust. That Taibbi's response was, that makes sense. And now he says, oh, well, yeah, they blew up, but that's just because the economy is unpredictable. Nobody was doing anything wrong, except that they structured all the things I've just done as a sure thing of, wait for it, looting, which is a bad thing. And it means that it isn't just, oh, bad flip of the coin, 6, tails in a row, they lost. No, they're looting. AIG, using credit default swaps. And he knows this. He's written about this.
He's written about Joe Kasamo clearly.
Yeah. What he's written. He never understood the analytics. And then he says, oh, CDOs, they were terrible, magic beans. And you stuck a bunch of stuff in a box, shook it, and 28% of it came out as AAA. Okay, if that's a story you want to tell, why not tell the real story, which is 80% of it came out as AAA? Again, we are, more than a decade after the great financial crisis, and he doesn't understand the numbers at all. Right, nor does he know about liar's loans. What is he playing?
Let me just address that just real quick, because I want to set this up because the liar's loans is everything. Okay, and again, going back to everything we've learned from you from the SNL crisis as the first act moving forward, which I want to try to provide a little bit more color in this conversation. But again, Matt Taibbi wrote books like The Great Derangement and Griftopia, among others, that addressed predation. I remember clearly him sitting in Florida courtrooms wondering about what was happening on the back end in the foreclosures with paperwork that had gone awry because of the liar's loans that took place, that went through the entire system, that wound up in, quite frankly, liar's foreclosures. So he knew and had a broad-based understanding, particularly as you're talking about the derivatives. But in this particular article that just came out criticizing MMT, he was comparing the notion of developing through the mortgage-backed securities and the triple down, like you were just talking about, the top 60 whatever percent is going to perform, and then you go down, but you increase the interest rates for the guys at the bottom, but they're going to lose first, and that's kind of like junk bonds and everything else, but that ultimately metastasize to the whole system based on what we've learned because of the underwriting, because of the brokerage, before all of the liar's loans and the appraisal fraud and everything that would go into ultimately the consumer rating agencies and so forth that would build up to these derivatives we were talking about. And so the analogy that he was trying to make in this article, Bill, that I want you to address and try to make sense to me, because I think it's going to lead to the most important parts that are still missing from the conversation, is that he's comparing modern monetary theory and quantitative easing as the same thing, which it's not. But at the same time, he's like thinking that he's being sold and the market is being sold based on the amount of debt and everything else that he tries to pander down, that what he misinterprets from what he hears from Stephanie and so forth is that inflation is only caused if you don't have full employment and the kind of productive capacity and some of the other elements that go into that. And so he gets convoluted in this understanding, which just seems to be like a almost lazy like takedown of something that somebody somewhere in his universe doesn't want to acknowledge at this stage because it's a threat to something that he's involved with is the only thing that I can kind of take away from this. It's a lot of assuming on my part, but at the same time, I wonder if you can address, based on what you just started to percolate, was this notion of what he gets wrong based on the entire process from underwriting and brokerage and so forth through the liar's loans that besiege the system, regardless of what he thinks is the magical thinking of CDOs and so forth. But ultimately, what he gets wrong in these comparisons that are seemingly completely off the blackboard and not even relevant.
Okay, so elite looting, fraud by CEOs disappears from his entire narrative.
He doesn't understand control fraud.
Predation, targeted overwhelmingly against Black and brown Americans, disappears.
Which he knew at one point.
From his entire article.
Right.
Right. He blames subprime loans, even though the research has been in for over a decade,
right,
that the losses overwhelmingly came from liar's loans, which are not only fraudulent, but are induced by the lender to optimize looting.
Can you give us the difference between liar's loans and subprime?
Sure. A liar's loan, and I'll also tell you the non-difference. Okay, so let me start with the non-difference, actually. It is perfectly possible to make a loan that is both subprime, and what that meant is you had a very low credit score, and a loan in which the borrower's income was dramatically inflated, right? Because the lender chose not to verify the borrower's income and incentivize the loan brokers to massively inflate the borrower's income.
Where did we see that recently in Judge Ergeron's trial of Donald Trump, right?
Yes, all reprising very old fraud schemes that we saw optimized in the savings and loan debacle, and even before that in the Texas Rent-A-Bank scandal of the 1970s.
And all of media missed that it was the bank optimizing it for looting. So again,
not the bank, the CEO.
Well, the CEO, sorry.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right.
Big difference.
Right. That's the title. Again, Akerlof and Romer's title, two Nobel laureates agreeing, looking at our work by the regulators and the criminologists and saying, yes, this is looting. The economic underworld of bankruptcy for profit. Obviously, the bankruptcy is the firm, the bank, and the profit goes to the CEO or the head guy that created the credit default swaps at AIG, who got bonuses in the range of $12 million a year by this sure thing fraud. Okay. So liar's loans, people assume, must come from lying borrowers, but the borrowers don't even know the right numbers to put in. Only the loan brokers do. And if the lender wanted to stop it, it could stop it in a moment by simply verifying the borrower's income. And since they were overwhelmingly verifying the job, that literally would have taken 2 seconds extra to verify.
I just have to point this out real quick. I'm so sorry to interrupt, but it's like, look, people, we just were inundated with Donald Trump in this court, setting with Letitia James, based on people never asked the question, how is it possible that Donald Trump would triple the square footage of his penthouse that was never actually looked into by the due diligence of the lender, not to mention all of the stuff that we could go into based on him, lowering all of his income based on tax revenue that they could have cross reference to understand, he was playing that jig too. But anyway, it's what we're revealing to you is the con that created Don the con, nevertheless. Please continue.
Right. And what else disappears from the story? Whistleblowers, right? Because who were the biggest single group of whistleblowers in world history? The honest appraisers. Were 11,000 of them in the year 2000, 8 years before the peak of the great financial crisis, go online and give their full name and their addresses so they are identifiable, even though what they're telling us is the loan brokers are extorting appraisers to inflate appraised values and driving honest appraisers out of the business, which is called a Gresham's dynamic, which is also not present in anything Taibbi is writing about, even though it's the key dynamic. And this was accompanied by predation through the perverse compensation given to loan brokers, that where the bankers literally gave them massive, compared to their income, kickbacks, if and only if they screwed their customers by overcharging them in terms of interest rates. And these kickbacks were so large that in total, they exceeded all of the regular compensation, which is already enormously generous to the loan brokers.
Unbelievable.
Right? So this produces all of what I'm describing, an estimated present value loss of US GDP of 41.7 trillion with a T. A trillion's 1,000 billion in lost US GDP. And it is a major driver in reducing Hispanic with college education wealth by nearly 80%, and Black college educated wealth by nearly in the 65-ish% range, all of which disappears.
Absolute devastating, and I call financial terrorism, Bill. Look, because it was all, again, intent. It was predation. And I know you're going down this specific path, and I don't want to interrupt you too much, but it's important to point out, going back to Taibbi, though, again, Taibbi knew a lot about the predation. Again, he wrote The Great Derangement. He wrote Griftopia. He was deep inside this, but what he never fully understood was the control fraud, why the banks did what they did, and ultimately how they did it through the Gresham's dynamic, and what the nut was with the incentives, which would have made everything from Elaine Flashman and everything else that he was in the midst of, particularly as it related to AIG, make more sense, which is why we had to make the con, which is why I found you, which is why we put all of this together. But to jump back into the Substack, misleading scenario, is he gets into the aftermath of the great financial crisis. The explosion, the implosion, everything that tripwired this thing when AIG melted down. And then, of course, repo melted down because of Goldman and everything that happened in that time period. But ultimately, which leads to, in the article, him trying to manifest quantitative easing to be MMT. Can you address that?
Yes, but let me first do the more general thing that he's doing, right? And that is, he is trying to say, look how crazy these MMT types are. After this terrible period of abuses called the Great Financial Crisis, right away, they went, and was based on magical economic thinking. They, MMT folks, went to magical economic thinking, except that it's exactly the reverse. It's dead wrong. By dead wrong, I mean here that not only is it not true, the opposite is true. Because after all, the University of Missouri, Kansas City, where Stephanie Kelton, Randy Ray, and I were all colleagues, was an absolute leader, not just in the nation, but in the world, in explaining all of these forms of elite predation and their impact in producing this macroeconomic disaster as well, and us trying to do two things. One, to stop a reoccurrence, which was the whole idea of the con as well, of these frauds, but two, to get out of the other magical economic insanity, which is, oh, you can't run a budget deficit as a country with a fully sovereign currency because there be dragons. We can't explain why, but there be dragons, and the whole place will blow up. And that was all in service of, we should not have any meaningful stimulus. And that was the argument of the ultra-right economists who are responsible for the magical thinking that Taibbi opposes. But now he's joined them. And he has joined expressly their magical thinking. So the first part, as you say, is, okay, how am I going to make this case that MMT did something terrible? Well, that's kind of difficult, because at the very first thing in his article is demonstrating that elite Democratic economists, actually appointed types like Jared Bernstein, they have no clue how the fiscal system works, the monetary system works. None. They are not MMTers. They did not adopt MMT policies at any time. What are you talking about? But in fairness, relative to the insane magic bean folks, the ultra-conservative economists that Taibbi is now in league with, Obama had less complete adherence to magic bean theory of austerity. And so he did some limited stimulus at the beginning. And guess what? We ran a real world experiment, the United States versus the EU. Guess who used far more stimulus? The United States. Not nearly enough. We urged far more, but significant compared to Europe. And look at the numbers, folks. Look how quickly the US recovered to full GDP pre-great financial crisis compared to the EU recovery. And it is many years, right? Similarly, the US recovery from COVID and the supply chain shortages has been much faster in the United States. And we have had this incredible period of very low unemployment and rapidly falling inflation. And that's compared to every other developed free economy in the world. The US is off the charts better. So we've run these two big experiments in the real world. Our policies weren't followed in either one, but there was more stimulus in the United States by far than in many of these other places. And the results have been a spectacular success. So if you're Taibbi, you should be saying, hey, this MMT stuff, we have barely scratched the surface of what you can do under MMT, and the results, to the extent we kind of use it a little, have been spectacularly beneficial. So that's not going to work. Taibbi can't go there. So what does everybody hate right now? What are the swear words? QE, quantitative easing. I know. I will simply assert QE is MMT. Now note, I can't explain why it is MMT, because A, it isn't MMT. It is a complete non sequitur. It has nothing to do with MMT. And there is the inconvenient fact that leading MMT scholars in writing oppose QE. Something you will not learn from reading Matt Taibbi. He will write in a way that claims the opposite. But back to magic beans. He believes the magic beans of the ultra-right economists in America. And that magic bean is, oh, you can't have a government with a fully sovereign currency run a deficit. That will produce catastrophe any century now, because actually we've been running deficits for the great bulk of our history. And we've actually never had hyperinflation in the United States. Sorry, Matt, 20% for 2 months inflation isn't remotely hyperinflation. And it also has nothing to do with MMT. It has a lot to do with COVID and supply disruptions, right? And maybe a little bit with QE, which again is not MMT. The Venn diagrams do not intersect, not MMT, when you talk about QE. And hey, what did Matt cite to show that MMT was QE, or QE is MMT? Oh, nothing. He couldn't find anything to cite for that, right? So where are the magic beans? The magic beans are in believing that if the government with a fully sovereign currency runs a deficit, catastrophe has to happen. Why? There's nothing theoretical that explains that would happen. Is there anything empirical? History? No. And we've had centuries of experience. Well, what could I do to say it's a disaster? I know, I'll not do that. So what he does instead is that Stephanie Kelton says something that is indisputably true. And we know it's true because it's a tautology, right? So it's an accounting identity, right? So if you've ever read anything about a financial thing, you would know, for example, basically, well, what's the net worth or capital of a firm? Assets minus liabilities equal capital. Well, could I rearrange that to say, well, then what are liabilities? Well, yeah, that's real simple math, right? To rearrange that. Those have to be true because they're definitionally true. They're descriptive. And MMT is overwhelmingly a description created by really hard work for decades by dozens and dozens of scholars. But among those great scholars are two that I had the great benefit of being my colleagues, Stephanie Kelton and Randy Ray, who are exceptionally good. And that's why Jared Bernstein couldn't answer the most simple questions, because conventional economists are not taught how the financial system actually works. So getting this description right is actually really important. And here's the key thing, which again is definitionally true, unless you use magic beans the way that Taibbi has done. When the government spends the money, transfers funds to citizens, for example, that doesn't make the money or the value disappear. It moves it from one entity to another. So the deficit increasing, what's actually happening is money flowing to us, making us wealthier. Now, that doesn't mean you should create deficits without limit. And MMT has never said that. But it does mean there's no magic mean answer that says, oh, you shouldn't run a deficit because that's terrible. No, actually, it can be really good. And I just explained that earlier. The United States recovery from the two worst financial crises of this century have been massively better than the recovery of nations that didn't use fiscal stimulus.
So the thing that
we've run a test, a real world test, and Matt never bothers to tell the reader that. Instead, he says, oh, how dare she say, how dare she? It's a magic bean to say that if the government gives money to citizens, the money hasn't been destroyed. It's been given to citizens. Right? That's not magic beans. That's definitional reality. And again, there can be bad things. If you cause serious inflation, that can be a bad thing. But again, nobody in the MMT economic world has been in charge of US economic policy at any time in the history of this nation. And again, QE is not MMT, and leading MMT scholars opposed QE. They didn't support it. And the reason they opposed it is it's not MMT.
All that makes sense to me, but there's so much more, Bill, because look, from the journey that we've been on and from what I read, what was such a pivot from where Matt has always been was that this obviously, as you've resonated this entire time, has echoes of right-wing austerity. I don't even know what the word is. Austerians, people that believe in austerity, right? Which are typically the rich, control the money for themselves. So you blame everybody else that if they get too much, it's going to lead to a hyperinflation, and that's going to have Marxist, I guess, characteristics, right? That's where he was leaning. That's what this entirety of the scenario is.
That's the ultimate, and as you say, double insanity. It isn't just, though it is, everything that I've said, wherever he goes, it just so happens, as with ultra right-wing economists, that the policies help the rich and hurt everybody else. Okay? But it's beyond that. Matt Taibbi, has joined as an acolyte of Musk and Trump the attack on democracy. Right? Because what he says is, oh, it's outrageous that Randy Wray thinks there should be higher marginal income tax rates on the richest Americans. By the way, our marginal income tax rates are ballparkish federal, a fourth of what they were in the period when, so many historians talk about America being its greatest in such, right? Even under somebody like Dwight Eisenhower, a bona fide conservative and fiscal conservative in such, we had marginal tax rates that were vastly higher than we have now. But Taibbi says it is not legitimate for a democratic government to have a higher marginal tax rate for the ultra wealthy. Why? Because he doesn't believe in democracy, right? So it's also illegitimate to have effective social programs. Read it closely. This is what he is saying in substance. If we have the money, say, rural counties in America, all over the nation, are overwhelmingly depopulated. And one of the biggest reasons is there's no hospital in entire counties. There's something like, I think, 70 counties in Georgia or more that have no hospital. Well, are you going to stay, whether you're the pregnant woman or the husband of the pregnant woman, in a place where you have to travel 2.5 hours to get to a hospital, a maternity ward? That's insane, right? And your kids, when they get in, have a medical emergency, this is just crazy. And what happens, therefore, in those kind of counties is the depopulation occurs very quickly, and all the folks that have better education and job prospects tend to be the ones that leave first. So why not have better hospitals in rural areas? That would be a great thing for the government to do. It would be great for society. That is the type of thing Matt Taibbi defines as should not be allowed. He calls that arbitrary, to have the government respond to social needs. Arbitrary.
Got it. Okay, but I'm going to plant a couple of seeds and then I'm going to bring it full circle because this is incredibly important that I want to understand. Okay, so the net of what we have discovered on our path through the con to understand what led to Randy Wray's prescient work that I was aware of in 2012, but I didn't know nearly as well as I now know. And I didn't, obviously, going through the 2008 great financial crisis myself, because the government itself had failed to do the investigation that we ultimately had to do on the con, that you come to understand in 2009 when all of these spectacular programs, these alphabet soups of these liquidity programs that took place during the Fed's 98 meetings, after we had been sold TARP, for example, as I recall, that the government had to, in a quick kind of a segue, that people need to understand that when we're talking about the Federal Reserve and we're talking about the federal government, there's two different pathologies of policy. I mean, there's fiscal policy and there's monetary policy, and so they're not the same thing. And so when we're talking about the Fed and we're talking about M1, M2, and all of these other types of scenarios, they are not dealt with what the budget of the United States is able to accomplish vis-a-vis what Stephanie always calls, sort of the I guess the agreement of Congress, so to speak. If everybody could get on the same page to budget fiscally, some of the things that you had just suggested, that obviously, the way the United States government had been erected was that Congress has the power of the purse to do exactly what you just said. That's not to be confused with the actual crisis in the aftermath of the 2008 great financial crisis that took roughly a $4.5 trillion bubble, which was built on predation and elite control fraud, which we lay out, in detail every step of the way at www.thecon.tv, but ultimately led to all of these derivatives. And there was, depending on the numbers, so we talked, as you may recall, with they were at the Commodity Futures Modernization Act, or what was the attorney out of Maryland who was the general counsel for the woman who was the hero in this whole thing, Brooksley Born, and was it Green? I can't think of.
Greenberg.
Yeah, Greenberg, right? And you remember he had mentioned to us that, when they tried to stop the derivatives stuff.
Greenberger, I think,
Yeah,
actually.
Greenberger. That's it. I'm so sorry, Greenberger. But it started off when they started to get into it and do the analytics that it was like a 90. I want to say it was. Oh man, I'm forgetting the figures. I mean, it was extraordinary when they first started seeing it after long-term capital management in the late 90s. But by the time you got to the GFC, 2006, 7, 8, the derivatives market and the over-the-counter derivatives and the notional value and all that kind of stuff had morphed globally into this you know, this tsunami in the hundreds of trillion, or not, yeah, it was hundreds of trillions,
Yes.
hundreds of trillions of dollars, right? So all manifesting from a $4.5 trillion housing bubble, right? And that ultimately led to all of these emergency programs that took place behind the scenes when Congress decided to have TARP, $700 billion in emergency funding to be able to create liquidity to get supposedly the toxic assets that the banks had created that were stuck on their books that were manifested from the liar's loans, among other things that we're talking about. There was more to it than that. But as we learned through the numbers that came through um, the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, I'm thinking of the operation that did the numbers. Remind me of there was like
It
80.
was actually University of Missouri, Kansas City graduate students that did the numbers that looked at all the loans that went out and created the total volume and timing of those loans.
You're talking
And
about
the idea, as you say, of those loans was largely to keep the bad assets from being sold, where they would have to recognize the loss. So they could just use it as collateral and get, real cash from the Fed to be able to do their business, and then they wouldn't have liquidity problems.
Right, which what they found out, and that's the Levy study that you're referring to, that they had revealed in 2012, I believe, something along the lines of 29 trillion in emergency capacity, correct? And then later, Randy had revealed that it was more like 33 trillion. Go ahead and comment on that.
Right. And what people might want to know is that the Levy Institute and UMKC have long been centers of study of modern monetary theory that work very closely together and have had people go, from UMKC to the Levy Institute, particularly Randy Ray and such.
But this came through, and then ultimately it led to, in addition to all of those different emergency lending apparatus with different programs and different dates, in terms of ultimately what was being able to be loaned to what was then a bankrupted financial system because they choked on their own cooking created through the toxic loans that manifested through everything we reveal in the con, which I would like to ask you, because Taibbi doesn't understand, and I've read the statutes of Federal Reserve Act 13.3, and nowhere does it say that you're supposed to loan 100% on the dollar to collateral that has been basically bankrupted, but especially through all of the calamity of the racketeering vis-a-vis liar's loans, right? I mean, it's like, can you address really quickly some of the problems that you see from your previous position and regulation and everything that you were trying to stop, that ultimately we provided tens of trillions of dollars of emergency liquidity to prop back up?
Sure. So to go back to what I talked about earlier, credit default swaps. Remember what Taibbi said was not a predatory thing, a reasonable thing, and it was just bad luck that it didn't work out. And that was, we're going to switch from real insurance against loss to credit default swaps, which we're going to call as if it were insurance, even though somehow it's going to be vastly cheaper, which is to say it won't buy nearly as much protection against loss, right? And then we're going to use that to reduce bank capital. In the midst of the biggest bubble in world history, with all these losses piling up, we're going to massively reduce bank capital. That's insane, right? How much? Well, Matt doesn't use numbers much, but he says mountains of capital. Okay, so massive amounts. And that is going to mean that the institutions, if you have a much smaller capital requirement, you can borrow, leverage, and create a massively bigger bank. And that's going to do a bunch of things. One, it's going to expand the losses enormously. If you're doing these, what he agrees are toxic CDOs, the toxic CDOs are going to blow up. You supposedly provided insurance from the CDS, but you've only brought in something like 1/4 the revenue to insure it of a real insurance company. But the losses are going to be the full 4/4. So the insurance company is going to go bankrupt. The banks doing the CDOs that bought the CDS insurance, which isn't really insurance, will go bankrupt. But now, because they have leveraged and grown enormously, their losses will be much greater. But that's just the start of it, because many more of them will also be too big to fail. And therefore, there's going to be a felt need to bail them out because they hold the economy hostage. Yes, you can shoot us, but the whole economy, yeah, right. Take a gun to your own head. Blazing Saddles, for those that understand the homage. Not very good, right? But on top of that, the bubbles will be much bigger because all these institutions are growing, and they're growing through the same means, which is liar's loans pushed into CDOs. So the systemic risk will be far greater, as well as the group that is treated as too big to fail will be much greater. Plus, you produce all kinds of weird liquidity disasters out of all this, such that no normal system can handle it. Folks, in the great financial crisis, the US did not simply bail out the US. We bailed out the Swiss National Bank, central bank, which otherwise would have been in liquidity disaster in terms of dollars. Okay? So again, you have no good choices. There's no magic bean. Again, Taibbi has got it like exactly wrong about the magic stuff. MMT says there's no magic bean. You have to actually understand the system. Now, what do governments like to do in these situations? Do they want to advertise how much they're bailing out the richest folks in the world while screwing or not giving much to the poor, especially like poor blacks and whites who were systematically
Set up.
predated on?
Yep.
Through these kickbacks to pay grotesquely higher rates and such? No, they don't want to do that. So they like to do it sub rosa, under the surface.
Yep.
Can you do that with finance? Well, sure you can. And especially because the Fed is not subject to normal governance. It's not really democratic. But the Taibbis of the world and their patrons, the Trumps, the Musks, what do they fear? Democracy. That people will vote and say, yes, there should be much higher marginal tax rates. No, we shouldn't let people rip off through predation these folks. We shouldn't kill them through meth and a whole bunch of other drugs, where you hire McKinsey to give you a study on how you can supercharge the sale, illegal sale, but you don't put that
Well,
document, that's going to kill tens of thousands of people. So that, yeah, there are lots of problems with democracy in America, but the answer is not to destroy democracy. It's to fix it and make it more democratic.
well, I'm glad you brought that back, though, because this is with the whole purpose of what Matt missed about you and others that I'm going to go into briefly. But I wanted to just mention this because it just came to my head while you were talking. It was Clayton that I was trying to refer to that did the analytics that showed us during the Federal Crisis Inquiry Commission that I think liar's loans had reached approximately 80% in the vintage 2006 area. So what we were loading up in all of these magic, securities and the derivatives of those securities and the CDOs and the CLOs now with commercial real estate, were what Taibbi is referring to, all came through this control fraud mechanism through Gresham's dynamic, where lying, cheating, and deceiving was the point for the number to kick it up, because that's the way modern executive compensation works. But when it all failed, to your point just now, we had these emergency situations because obviously you had to save. There was no good choices, as you put it, right? But here comes the big,
There are good choices, or at least better choices, before the disaster,
right?
Which is why you need effective regulation, effective prosecution,
Absolutely.
and to do that, you need effective democracy.
So when Stephanie Kelton and the deficit myth, and I, you and I and Eric attended the conference, and I've read all of it, and I've got a pretty cursory understanding, but I understand the basics of MMT, and again, I understand the descriptive nature of it in sovereign currency and what federal taxes pay for and what state taxes pay for, and it's all extremely important for people to wrap their heads around. But it's not the magic bean that Taibbi is describing it as a Marxist sort of answer to be able to I don't know what, create more disaster, which is going to lead to hyperinflation. And they always go back to the Wehrmacht, or the what I'm thinking of post World War I Germany, that would Weimar, into all of the and I do always say that corruption bursts and fuels fascism. So the point's not lost on me. But we're sovereign currency and all of these other things. But the long and the short of it is, but Bill, the thing that Taibbi didn't get, which is everything we just talked about, which was all things Bill Black, which was the GFC was the third act.
No, it's not all things Bill Black. So
I'm
again,
getting the
what I
control.
was super lucky in was my colleagues. And what Matt gets consistently wrong is that, and I don't want to say it was only the three of us, but just for brevity, the three of us
Sure.
worked together, and we all learned from each other, and we had, of course, differences.
You're talking about Stephanie
we
Kelton, you're
were
talking about Randall Ray, and you're
Stephanie
talking
Kelton and Randy Ray and Bill Black worked together and agreed on all the essentials. And so, again, it's not that Randy Ray and Stephanie Kelton ignored depredation and fraud and magic bean stuff by economists and by the financial engineers, as they call themselves, although that's an insult to real engineers. It's exactly the opposite. Stephanie and Randy have many talks in which they emphasize the role of fraud and predation. And I, of course, had many talks in which I would bring in, where relevant, the modern monetary theory in my discussion of how to respond to these kinds of crises. So it's 180 degrees off of what Taibbi tries to present. He's the one that has changed. And he's the one that has consistently changed, where what drops out? All the things where poorer, weaker people get hurt. And all the things in which get added are, we can't have income taxes like we had for 40 plus years in the United States, with
Right, but we've been
higher marginal rates, God forbid. We can't have government fixing social problems, actually addressing social problems.
right.
That's not legitimate. This at a time when his patrons, the people he's pushing their policies, want to destroy democracy. Matt Taibbi's central position is democracy is illegitimate.
But it's also that's insane enough amidst all of the other insanity that we're dealing with. But the furtherance of that is we've spent tens of trillions of dollars since 2009, Bill, to be able to, through a variety of mechanisms. I understand the mandate of the Fed is to 2% inflation and full unemployment. What we've seen is protecting the interests of the uber wealthy, particularly going back to the last 3 or the 4 largest bankruptcies in the United States, going back to Silicon Valley Bank last year. But tens of trillions of dollars have been used to stimulate the economy, which has benefited the top 0.001%, i.e. Elon Musk, who tripled his wealth during COVID. But going back briefly to where you were at the beginning, I will never forget as long as I live. Seeing right when we started our journey together, when you formulated the notion of the Bank Whistleblower United and everything that we were involved with Richard Bowen and Michael Winston and Gary Agary and ultimately Chris Swecker and others and Paul Pelletier that would be involved, the new untouchables, that we've got to be able to get the message to the people that there are solutions to these immense problems that are creating what the topic of this is. But there was an opportunity in 2016. I was talking to Stephanie Kelton to try to get Bernie Sanders on camera with you prior to the Brooklyn debate in 2016. And I will never forget, as long as I live, hearing Bernie say that Wall Street's business model is fraud, and you could have heard a pin drop. There was no follow-up. There was no massive push forward to reveal everything that we were revealing in the con ultimately. And I'd like you to just make clear to people that this fight has been going on probably for centuries, but at least in your lifetime, going back to the 80s and 90s, specifically as it relates to the savings and loan crisis, through all things Milken and all of the things that would lead to Trump that we discussed with, of course, David K. Johnston and so forth. This is not new, and yet it gets worse and worse every single time. And here we are in 2024 with Matt Taibbi, who was once a champion of all of the people that got destroyed by this malfeasance, this massive criminal rot of our financial system that just simply reached into, the central bank through the full faith and credit of the United States to reboot on top of basically the bones of the middle class, is the way I look at it, which you have been trying to protect your entire career. Can you kind of just make it make sense what people are missing about the fraud that we have an opportunity, if people would just listen, to understand how we can reboot the system?
Okay, so several different things. One, what MMT demonstrates through logic and empiricism and just plain description is why a fully sovereign nation state is enormously different than, say, a state or a city government or a private household. So Bernie Sanders was a mayor, and mayors can't run substantial deficits. They are not fully sovereign. That was the formative experience of his life in public service. And so I can tell you, Bernie Sanders is sort of like patellar tendon response, stimulus response is you can't have deficits. Deficits are terrible things. So it isn't just ultra-conservative economists. People have been taught for such a very long time, and in many facets of their life, after all, you and I can't run huge deficits, type of thing. We are not fully sovereign nation. So this is a more difficult thing to understand. And that's why Taibbi wrote this article, because he is afraid that folks like Randy and maybe even more Stephanie have found a way to explain this to regular humans and that they get it. That's what Taibbi centers on, that people say they get it. And that's what horrifies them, because that means you could get an actual mass movement. Democracy.
Right, to challenge the status quo or those who smash and grabbed and looted to
And make better things better,
right.
type of thing, right? So, yes, there is that. Now, beyond that, we have anti-democratic institutions by design. Two obvious ones. One is the Federal Reserve, where the whole idea is not to allow any popularly elected folks to have any influence, right? And indeed, there are tons of speeches and research papers by central banks claiming this was created the great moderation, as they call it, is one of the greatest things in ever. You finally gave us, the savants, all the power over at least monetary policy, and look how great the world is. Oops, just as they were celebrating themselves, and it blew up. But Congress, for instance, can't get information the same way out of the Fed. And there are all kinds of conflicts of interest in the Fed that no one should allow. What's the other institution that's profoundly anti-democratic and has not even ethical standards by any outside? The Supreme Court.
I was thinking of a few others, but that was the one that came to mind.
Which are the two institutions that have gone and done terrible things to our country? Horrible, horrible things.
And I want to point this out.
Anti-democratic institutions. Who does Taibbi want? He wants even more anti-democratic institutions. It doesn't make there's no internal logical consistency, because there's no logic. It's just a bunch of metaphors, and abracadabra, using words like that. There's
the way
not analytics.
Right. The way it relates to Taibbi, I suspect that somebody somewhere along the lines had some influence, because he did spend some time in Moscow, that he had some skeletons in his closet. And lo and behold, many years later, it might be easier to tell a bunch of lies and make a lot more money than what the pathway he was on, which is extremely disappointing for us all. But to kind of tie this up right now, and I think it would be terrific if we could have further conversations with some of your colleagues to this extent, particularly in light of the fact that the new documentary movie is out there. But in context to, it's I wouldn't believe this unless I saw it with my own eyes, all of it. And look, Bill, I just want to summarize it this way. We've got 91 indictments against the president, and it looks like only one criminal trial is going to go to the distance because of the revolving door that you talked about. The Supreme Court, a lot of people are starting to finally get hip to what's Clarence Thomas and, the Republican appointed guys have been up to, not to mention Alito and the upside down flag. All of this stuff is just so antithetical to everything that we were, but it's all out in the open now. But to that point further, Alan Greenspan came from none other than Lincoln Savings, which is what you had in the crosshairs, and Keating, the CEO at that time, when you were putting it down on all of the fraud that was taking place at that time. And I might add that one of his big pillars was being an anti-porn crusader when he was raping women that were, I'm talking about, metaphorically, through their savings and their pensions and their husband, what their husbands left behind, which was monumentally more destructive. Not then, whatever you want to, just disgusting, this hypocrisy that's been going on. Greenspan becomes basically the guy at the Fed forever that allowed all of this stuff to happen. what I learned very interestingly in our journey was that I had always known that the Fed was mandated by Congress, particularly through the Home Equity Ownership Protection Act. And ultimately, that means that the Fed is answerable to Congress. But Congress is such a mess, to your point. And then what we've seen in the last however many appointments to the chair of the Federal Reserve, a guy like Jerome Powell came from where? None other than the Carlyle Group. He's a private equity hedge fund guy. So whose interests are being served by an independent branch that supposedly isn't corrupt? And there was all sorts of insider trading scandal that took place about 2 or 3 years ago, not to mention everything that's been going on now. Can you bring it home as to what's at stake right now, given the fact that the government is proving that all of the fraud and deceptive acts and practices and defrauding the United States through racketeering and all sorts of manner, shape, or form of documentation fabrication that Donald Trump's been in the midst of by way of racketeering in all of these different cases, if the government can prove that this is all illegal, even though we're not going to see it go to trial because of all of the corruption, Bill, can you encapsulate what you've been in the midst of, and you've taught us for the last 10 years on our end, but you've been in the midst of for the last 30 years?
So to encapsulate it, it would be the people of the United States of America have enormous potential capacity. MMT, in large part, is about exactly that. Doesn't tell you exactly what the balances should be necessarily in a particular situation. It says you have the capacity to make choices. And you can be bold and you can fix things. Democracy has the capacity, as in the savings and loan debacle, to put 1,700 elite white collar criminals and convict them. In the banking industry at the same time, that number was around, I think, 2,600 or 2,500. We know how to succeed. We can succeed, and therefore people are terrified of us succeeding. They are terrified of democracy, not because of its abuses, but because of its capacity. They are terrified of our economic capacity to do things for the American people and people elsewhere, if that, when that makes sense, right? It's our abilities, it's our capacities, it's our proven abilities that terrify the Musks and the Trumps of the world. And for some reason, and I'm not going to speculate why, Taibbi has decided to throw in his lot. And, it's not, I mean, yeah, it's a smear, but it's just such a bad smear. It's terrible. I mean, terrible in the sense of pathetic. I was shocked. I was shocked when Mehdi Hassan started questioning him and he collapsed. And he collapsed in this piece as well. And it's a shame. It doesn't appear now that he ever had a very good grasp on actually the specifics of how the abuses and frauds and predation occurred. But he certainly seemed to have his heart in the right place, and he had a great turn of phrase. And that's a really good thing and such. So me, I always hope for redemption. We would be very happy if he wants to have a real road to Damascus experience. and rejoin the fight for democracy and the people of the United States. And we'd be happy to help him.
Well, that's a
Wish him
beautiful.
well.
Wow. That's a beautiful sentiment to end off on, because I was thinking as you were going through that at first, I was like, maybe it was better that we didn't tie our lot to Taibbi given where he's at. But at the same time, it's like, you've always taught us, and I've always bought into completely, it's not necessary to hope to persevere. And there's a lot more information than we've shared in this hour and a half dialogue, and there's more to come. As always, Bill, I can't thank you enough for your expertise and your insight. I will make sure to hopefully get this out to the folks that need to see it, and particularly Taibbi, and we'll see where the bouncing ball goes. But in light of all of this stuff, it's all on the line, Bill. I mean, I don't think, like the great David Byrne said, this ain't no party, this ain't no disco, this ain't no fooling around. Corruption burns and fuels fascism. The insanity that we're seeing right now that's leading to this, I'm going to call it a quasi-Confederate state. Go ahead.
3 hours before we tape this, roughly, the Trump campaign put out on its big, re-election effort,
Okay.
a repost calling for the great advantage of the next Trump term would be, and I quote, the unified Reich.
Well, I rest my case.
That is what we've descended to.
And there's no time.
Parts of it have. And, this is the frame, the framers literally at the Declaration of Independence, and such, Constitution. What have you given us? A republic, sir, if you can keep it.
Well, it's incumbent upon us, and I'm following your lead, and we need to electrify millions of people who believe in liberty and justice for all to redeem the dream. And I don't mean to be, silly, but the bottom line is, we're up against it right now. But the thing is, like you've said, we know how to fix this. We have the answers. We just have to get the critical mass of the people that get beyond the lies and can elevate to what we're revealing, which is clarity. The system can work and does. Go ahead.
Yeah, we also have to get the folks who have just given up hope. I mean, they would be highly sympathetic with all of our aims, but they just can't believe that they will never be perfect. I mean, none of us are talking about that.
No.
But they can be vastly better. And we have proven it. We've proven that we know how to succeed. And the United States, again, for all its faults, is by far the leader among the quote unquote free world, what remains of it, in how it's responded economically over the last 15 years or more, actually. So, join the struggle.
Please look up William K. Black, people. Watch The Con at www.thecon.tv. Check out our work with the new Untouchables that you can find on just doing a Google search. But more importantly, Bill Black and his team with Ed Gray and many of these other absolute heroes with not a lot of resources were able to discover, unpack, figure out, and try and prosecute. 1,700 is the number that
over 1,700.
Over 1,700 elite white collar executives.
Not prosecute, convict.
Convict. Sorry, convict. 1,700 elite white collar predators in a scheme that was 1/180th the size of the great financial crisis, in which we did zero. We have the
and check out Stephanie Kelton and Randy Ray's very accessible online stuff and their books. I highly recommend them to you. You'll find, for example, that if you took a standard economic course about money, maybe 8% of it was accurate. Most of it was myth.
If it wasn't for
You'll
Randy,
enjoy.
if it wasn't for UKMC Randy Ray and your team and all of the graduate students that put together the Levy study, we would have no idea what the real cost of the great financial crisis was.
Right. And I just, we don't have time to talk about the entire MMT community. I'm not trying to just say there are these two, stars and, a few other worker bees. It's a much broader community. And again, I think you would enjoy learning about it and the possibilities it opens up.
Fantastic. Mr. Black, we appreciate it. Don't forget, check out June Black's. When you hold up the book one last time?
One last time.
Yeah, this is a hit, and it's a fantastic fair shake. And what's it say on the bottom? Because I know the book, Women and the Fight to
Women and the Fight to Build a Just Economy.
There you go.
And I would just say what June discovered, bizarrely, because they were approaching it from a very different lens, was if you look at the pathologies in the economy time after time, it's essentially the same story. And one of the symptoms of it is that women tend to be essentially the canary in the coal mine, where often the pathology, a related pathology, shows up first.
Well, Bill, thank you for your time. All the best to June, and I'll be in touch shortly.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.